Karen bans teen from shoveling snow for neighbors, then slips on her own driveway. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Buffalo winters have a way of binding neighbors together, whether they want it or not. There's something about living in a place where the snow can pile up to your waist overnight and where the wind can howl so fiercely it rattles even the best sealed windows that makes people depend on one another, even if it's only to dig out a buried car or share a mug of hot cocoa after braving the cold. Our cul-de-sac, nestled at the edge of a sprawling suburb in Buffalo, New York, was the kind of place where everyone more or less knew each other's business, not in a nosy way, well, except for a few people, but in the gentle, inevitable way of people who had seen each other's kids grow up, traded recipes over sagging fences, and watched every driveway slowly disappear under another fresh blanket of lake-effect snow. Every winter, as soon as the first real storm hit, a kind of unofficial routine would begin. The dads would fire up their ancient snowblowers with all the ceremony of lighting a torch at the Olympics. The kids would dive into snowbanks and emerge with red cheeks and streaming noses, and the teens, myself included, would shoulder their shovels and fan out, looking for work or, more honestly, for a little extra cash for movies, snacks, or whatever new thing we were saving up for. It was a small, safe way to feel a little more grown up in a world where there was never quite enough independence to go around. I'd been shoveling driveways for neighbors since I was 13, first tagging along with my older brother, then, as he moved on to college, taking over his clients and adding a few of my own. People knew me as the polite, responsible kid who showed up on time, did a good job, and always made sure to toss a treat to any pets who came out to supervise. I never charged much, just enough to make it worth bundling up and braving the sub-zero mornings, and I was always happy to help out for free when someone couldn't pay or when the job was especially tough for someone older. It was the kind of arrangement that worked perfectly, not because there were any formal rules, but because everyone trusted each other and, deep down, knew the work would get done one way or another. It felt like an unspoken contract, the kind of thing that probably didn't exist in fancier neighborhoods with rigid HOAs and posted signs, but in our corner of Buffalo, it was as reliable as sunrise after a long night of snowfall. That changed the winter Karen moved in. She arrived just before the first big storm, pulling up in a spotless SUV with out-of-state plates, her energy loud even through the glass as she swept onto her porch in a bright red coat, phone already pressed to her ear. Karen was unlike anyone we'd had in the cul-de-sac before, brisk, efficient, and keenly interested in every rule, regulation, and guideline the neighborhood had ever seen. Within a week, she joined the local Facebook group, commented on a half-dozen posts about street parking, and introduced herself to everyone within a 5-house radius, leading with her name and immediately following it up with, "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here." If the rest of us were snowed-in survivors, Karen was the hall monitor dropped in from a warmer climate, and if she had ever used a snow shovel herself, she certainly didn't show it. I first ran into her one early Saturday morning, shovel in hand, halfway through clearing old Mrs. D'Amico's walk. Mrs. D, as everyone called her, was 90 and sharp as a tack but could barely make it down her steps in winter, let alone tackle the heavy snow that always seemed to drift across her walkway. I'd just finished the last swipe and was reaching for the ice melt when I heard a voice behind me, high and clipped, asking, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" I turned to find Karen standing at the end of the driveway, her arms crossed tightly, a clipboard in hand, yes, an actual clipboard, like she was conducting an inspection. I explained that I was just helping out, that I did this for a lot of neighbors, and that I always made sure to clean up after myself. She looked me up and down as if I might be smuggling contraband in my boots, then informed me, very firmly, that soliciting for services was not allowed in the neighborhood. I tried to explain that I wasn't really soliciting, not in the door-to-door sense, and that people usually called or texted me if they needed help. Karen cut me off, launching into a lengthy explanation of how her old HOA back in Connecticut had strict rules about teenage hawkers and that it was simply a matter of safety and decorum. She said that offering to shovel was disturbing the peace and threatened to report me to both the HOA and, if necessary, my parents. I felt my cheeks burn with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, but more than that, I felt a kind of confusion I hadn't expected. No one had ever accused me of doing anything wrong before. If anything, people went out of their way to thank me. I stammered out an apology, unsure of what I was supposed to be sorry for, and promised I'd leave as soon as I was done. She watched me finish, making notes on her clipboard, and then marched up to Mrs. D'Amico's door to deliver a warning of her own about the dangers of unauthorized contractors. Mrs. D, bless her, just nodded and thanked her for her concern, but as soon as Karen was gone, she patted my gloved hand and whispered, "Don't you worry, sweetheart. Some people just need to feel important." That should have been the end of it, but the mood on the street shifted, just a little, after that morning. A few neighbors stopped me on the sidewalk to ask if Karen had really said all that, shaking their heads and assuring me not to let it get to me. One even slipped me an extra 5 and a thermos of cocoa, with a wink and a muttered, "Welcome to the real Buffalo." Still, I couldn't help but notice the way people started looking over their shoulders before calling me over, the way some parents quietly mentioned that maybe it would be best to wait until things blew over before I helped out again. Even my own parents, supportive as they were, told me to keep my head down and not make waves. I started to wonder if all the easy trust that had made shoveling for neighbors feel so normal was gone, replaced by a brittle kind of politeness that could snap at any moment. But if there's one thing Buffalo teaches you, it's that winters are long, and you can't stop the snow from falling, no matter how many rules you try to write. All it takes is one blizzard, one icy morning, for even the most carefully enforced order to be buried under another layer of white. And as I trudged home that day, the sky already heavy with the promise of more snow, I realized that sometimes the real test of a neighborhood isn't how well people follow the rules, but how they come together when things get tough. The days after my run-in with Karen moved with a slow, cold heaviness, as if the gray clouds overhead had seeped into the mood of the entire neighborhood. The temperature plummeted further, and every morning seemed to bring a fresh dusting of powder or a glistening layer of treacherous ice, the kind that could trip even the most seasoned Buffalonian. As the snow kept falling, I noticed fewer and fewer kids out with shovels or sleds, and the usual sounds of laughter and scraping metal that once echoed down our cul-de-sac were muted, replaced instead by an odd stillness. It was as if Karen's warning, delivered with such formality and finality, had frozen more than just the sidewalks. I stayed inside more, restless and frustrated, checking my phone and looking out the window at the drifts slowly rising up the sides of driveways and the mailbox that threatened to disappear beneath the weight of winter. The work, which I had grown to love for its sense of purpose and community, dried up almost overnight. Where I had once received a steady stream of texts and calls, now only a trickle came through, always from the same few who felt brave enough to defy Karen's decree. Karen's campaign against solicitation didn't stop with that first confrontation. Within days, flyers began appearing on mailboxes and telephone poles all down the street, bright yellow sheets printed with a warning about unauthorized snow removal, claiming it was against HOA policy to offer or receive paid shoveling services unless they were approved vendors. She cited sections of the bylaws that no one had ever bothered to read closely, using the word solicitation with a legal weight it surely didn't deserve, and signed each one a concerned neighbor. Everyone knew exactly who was behind it. Her energy seemed boundless as she swept from porch to porch in her vivid coat, clipboard always in hand, handing out the flyers personally to anyone who opened their door, and leaving them wedged into doors and car windshields for those who didn't. The neighborhood, so used to a relaxed attitude and the silent agreements of winter help, suddenly felt watched, as if every act of kindness might now be measured and judged. Despite her efforts, there were still small acts of quiet rebellion. I would find a folded $5 bill slipped into our mailbox from Mrs. D'Amico, accompanied by a note that read, "Thank you for everything, don't let the turkeys get you down." A few of the other older residents would call my parents and arrange for me to come by just for cocoa and a chat, but when I arrived, a shovel would be waiting at the door, and the gratitude in their eyes made me feel like maybe it was all still worth it. Even so, the energy was different. Some people, afraid of making waves or drawing Karen's ire, simply stopped calling altogether. Parents warned their kids to stay out of sight and to let the snow pile up a little longer, just until things cooled off. For the first time, my work felt furtive and forbidden, something to be done quickly and without notice, as if helping my neighbors had become an act of defiance instead of the simple gesture it had always been. Karen, meanwhile, became something of a self-appointed enforcer. She upped her patrols, marching down the street with a brisk determination, her eyes darting from driveway to driveway, watching for any sign of unauthorized activity. She would stop to chat with anyone willing, loudly proclaiming how important it was to follow the rules, and telling anyone who would listen that she had contacted the HOA to demand stricter enforcement. She took a particular interest in my movements, lingering near our property line and occasionally snapping photos of me with her phone whenever I dared to step outside with my shovel. She cornered my parents one evening as they were bringing in groceries, warning them about liability and how they could be held responsible if I was hurt or damaged someone's property. My mom, to her credit, smiled politely and told Karen that she appreciated her concern, but inside, I could see the stress building. The worry about getting dragged into some kind of neighborhood feud that could easily spiral out of control. Yet, for all her vigilance, Karen herself never hired anyone to clear her driveway or walk. She made a point of telling everyone that her son, home from college, would take care of it, that they were fully capable of handling their own snow without relying on teenagers or unlicensed labor. No one ever saw him, though, and with each new storm, her driveway became more treacherous. The snow compacted into thick, uneven mounds that froze hard overnight, and the edges of her walkway formed sharp, icy ridges that even the bravest dog walkers learned to avoid. It was a point of pride for her, it seemed, to show she could manage on her own, but it quickly became clear to everyone that her stubbornness was winning out over practicality. As the forecast began to warn of an incoming blizzard, one of those classic Buffalo storms that could shut down schools and bring the city to a halt, people in the cul-de-sac started whispering to each other, worried about the elderly neighbors and single parents who depended on someone to dig them out. The memory of the no solicitation flyers lingered, but necessity began to outweigh fear. Mrs. D'Amico's daughter called my mother, asking if I could come by early in the morning before Karen started her rounds. Another neighbor quietly slipped me extra cash and a thermos of coffee, whispering that she'd always appreciated my help, no matter what anyone said. It was a fragile, tense alliance. People wanted to support me, to stand up for what had always been a community tradition, but no one wanted to be the one to confront Karen directly. We all tiptoed through a winter defined not just by ice and snow, but by the invisible lines drawn through the neighborhood. As the night before the blizzard settled in, I stood at our front window and watched the first flakes swirl under the streetlights, gathering into drifts that promised a long, difficult morning ahead. My shovel rested by the door, boots lined up and ready. I knew that whatever Karen said, whatever rules she tried to enforce, there were neighbors counting on me, and the snow would not wait for permission to fall. It was a helpless, hopeful feeling, knowing that, in the end, winter always had the last word, and sometimes, the true measure of a community wasn't in its rules, but in how it looked after its own when the world outside turned cold and silent. The blizzard rolled in with a ferocity that even the oldest residents of our cul-de-sac claimed they hadn't seen in years, blanketing the world in white and muffling the usual morning noises until all that was left was the steady whisper of falling snow and the distant rumble of plows struggling to keep up. By the time I woke up, the windows were frosted with thick crystals, and my breath fogged in the hallway as I tiptoed toward the front door to peek outside. The street was transformed into an alien landscape, each house crowned with a foot of new snow, driveways vanished beneath rolling drifts, and the mailbox was little more than a humped suggestion in the middle of a snowbank. It was the kind of morning when even the bravest would hesitate to leave the warmth of bed, but for me, it was a call to action. I tugged on layer after layer, thermal shirt, 2 pairs of socks, sweater, heavy jeans, gloves, hat, scarf, boots, until I resembled a marshmallow more than a teenager, and then, after scrawling a note for my parents and swallowing a quick breakfast, I slipped out into the soft blue light of dawn, shovel in hand. The world was so quiet it almost hurt. The sound of my boots crunching through the snow felt deafening as I trudged from house to house, heart pounding with a mixture of determination and dread. My first stop was Mrs. D'Amico's, where I set to work carving out a narrow path from her door to the curb, muscles already burning with the effort of lifting shovelfuls of wet, heavy snow. The cold crept in everywhere, biting at my cheeks and wrists, but I pressed on, fueled by the knowledge that she'd be peeking through her curtains, waiting for the first sign she could safely retrieve her morning paper. When I finished, she tapped on the window and waved, her gratitude evident in the way her face lit up with relief, and I moved on to the next house, then the next, careful to keep my movements quiet and discreet, not wanting to draw unnecessary attention. Some neighbors left payment in envelopes taped to the door, others slipped me notes of thanks or offered up snacks and steaming mugs of cocoa. It felt like a covert operation, a community quietly rebelling against a rule none of us had ever wanted. As the morning wore on and the sun tried to break through the thick clouds, the cul-de-sac slowly came to life. Curtains twitched, doors opened a crack, and bundled figures emerged to assess the damage. My friend Josh joined me, bundled in so many layers his voice was almost unrecognizable, and together we tackled the biggest jobs: the elderly couple across the street, the new mom struggling to dig out her minivan, the single dad trying to make it to his shift at the hospital. We moved quickly, falling into an easy rhythm, working our way up and down the block, our breath rising in quick bursts of fog. There was an unspoken understanding that we were all in this together, that the rules that had made us so cautious in the past weeks simply didn't apply in the face of something as unstoppable as a buffalo blizzard. It didn't take long for us to notice that one house stood out from the rest. Karen's driveway, always perfectly edged and clear in the early days after she moved in, was now buried under a lumpy, frozen mass that looked more like the surface of a distant planet than a path for cars and people. Her porch steps were covered with a thick sheet of ice, and the snowplow's latest pass had left a formidable wall of icy debris blocking the end of her drive. There was no sign of movement from inside, no hint of shoveling or scraping, and the car in her driveway looked like it had been sealed there by nature itself. Josh nudged me and raised his eyebrows, but we said nothing, simply moving on to the next house as if we hadn't noticed. It was impossible not to feel a small spark of vindication at the sight. Karen, who had so loudly insisted that no one needed our help, whose son was supposed to be handling everything, had clearly been left to fend for herself, and the storm had won. The day stretched on, the snow never letting up, and the work began to take its toll. My shoulders ached, my fingers went numb no matter how many times I flexed them inside my gloves, and the cold seeped through every layer, stubborn and relentless. But there was something deeply satisfying about the steady progress we made, the neat, black ribbons of shoveled walkway, the grateful faces at each door, the knowledge that we were doing something that mattered. For hours, Karen's house remained silent, a frozen outlier among a sea of cleared drives, until sometime in the afternoon, a sudden flurry of movement caught everyone's attention. I was across the street helping the single dad with his car when I saw Karen finally emerge, bundled up in her bright red coat and clutching a plastic bucket of salt in one hand. She picked her way carefully down the steps, face set with determination, and began flinging handfuls of salt onto the icy patch in front of her door. For a moment, she seemed to be managing, her movements quick and controlled, but as she reached the bottom of the steps and tried to navigate the ridge left by the snowplow, disaster struck. One foot shot out from under her, and she landed hard, the bucket skittering across the ice as she yelped in pain and surprise. The sound carried down the street, and every head turned in unison, a tableau of neighbors frozen in mid-motion, shovels in hand and mouths half open. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, unsure how to respond. Karen struggled to sit up, clearly stunned, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and frustration. She called out, her voice shaking, "Can someone help me, please?" But the hesitation was palpable. I stood there, shovel in hand, heart pounding, watching as a dozen sets of eyes darted from me to Karen and back again. There was a brief, awkward silence, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first move. The memory of the flyers, the warnings, the threats, all of it lingered in the air, making it hard to step forward. I could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me, the unwritten question of whether kindness still mattered when it hadn't been returned. The snow continued to fall, soft and indifferent, covering everything in a fresh layer of silence, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to balance on the edge of a decision. There is a unique stillness that follows a fall, when the cold seems even colder and the neighborhood, so lively and full of motion moments before, slips into a strange, almost dreamlike silence. In that instant after Karen's cry for help, I felt the weight of every recent slight, every icy glare and yellow flyer, every uneasy conversation about rules and rightness. Around me, neighbors gripped their shovels and watched, their faces caught between sympathy and a wariness born from weeks of tension, as if all of us were stuck at a crossroads, unsure whether the old rhythms of kindness and looking out for each other still applied. It's easy to say you'd do the right thing in a moment like that you'd be the first to drop your shovel and rush across the street, but the truth is, sometimes hurt and resentment freeze people in place just as much as the snow does. I glanced over at Josh, who gave me a small, searching look, almost asking permission, or maybe reassurance. And it was in that uncertain moment that I realized none of us were going to move unless someone did first. My legs felt heavy as I made my way across the street, every step crunching into the brittle crust of snow and echoing too loudly in the sudden hush. I knelt beside Karen, who was struggling to sit upright, her face red and pinched, hair tumbling from her hood. She was clearly more embarrassed than injured, but her breath came in quick, choppy bursts and her eyes were glassy with humiliation. Up close, she looked smaller, less sure of herself than she had on all her patrols, and for a second, I almost saw her as just another neighbor caught out by winter's indifferent cruelty. I asked her if she was hurt, and after a shaky pause, she admitted her ankle felt not quite right. It took some awkward maneuvering, but with Josh's help and a bit of gentle encouragement from one of the moms who finally hurried over, we got her to her feet and, slowly, onto the porch where she could sit and catch her breath. No one said anything for a moment, the tension only breaking when Mrs. D'Amico called from across the street, "Are you all right, dear?" in her worried, grandmotherly voice. As the adrenaline faded, Karen tried to reassert her dignity, brushing off offers to call an ambulance and insisting it was just a slip. But when she glanced down at her still icy driveway, something seemed to shift in her expression, a resignation, maybe, or a grudging realization that this was not a battle she could win alone. I could see the way she looked at the stretch of ice that had upended her, the unfinished path to her car, the pile of salt spilled and wasted, and in that look was all the stubborn pride that had kept her from asking for help, now suddenly at odds with the very real, very human need for community. She thanked us, not quite meeting my eyes, her voice brittle and uncertain, and then, almost as an afterthought, asked if someone could finish clearing her walk so she wouldn't fall again. The words hung in the air, fragile as icicles, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd heard her right. I nodded, shouldered my shovel, and set to work, chipping away at the thick layers of ice and compacted snow. Josh joined me, then another neighbor, and before long, a small crew of us was scraping, salting, and shoveling, turning the treacherous patch into a safe, clear path. It wasn't lost on any of us how odd it felt to be doing this for the one person who had worked so hard to stop us from helping anyone at all, but there was a kind of relief in the work, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could go back to the way they'd been before. As we finished, Karen watched from her porch, her posture a little less rigid, the edges of her voice softer when she managed a second, more sincere thank you. She offered to pay, but I shook my head, telling her honestly that that wasn't why any of us were out there. For the first time, she looked genuinely confused, and then, quietly, grateful. That day changed something on our street. By the time the sun finally broke through the clouds, melting the icicles into diamond drops and painting the snow with a golden sheen, the cul-de-sac felt different, warmer, closer, even though the air still bit with winter's chill. People lingered longer on their stoops, waving and chatting, as if the storm had swept away more than just the snow. When Karen's son finally appeared that afternoon, looking sheepish and apologetic, he accepted our help without protest, thanking us for looking out for his mother when he couldn't get home in time. Word spread quickly about what had happened, not just about Karen's fall, but about the way the community had come together in the end, putting aside grievances for the sake of decency and neighborliness. The story rippled out, and soon, more people started openly supporting my snow shoveling work again, leaving tips and hot chocolate and, more than once, a thank you note with a joke about no solicitation allowed, except by you. Karen, for her part, changed in small but noticeable ways. She was never quite as loud or insistent about the rules after that day. She even stopped patrolling with her clipboard and, once, when I passed her on the sidewalk as spring approached, she gave me a brief, almost awkward smile before ducking into her car. The yellow flyers quietly disappeared, and the no solicitation rule was eventually brought up at the next HOA meeting, where the overwhelming consensus was to let the neighborhood teens continue their time-honored tradition of helping out. People argued that community shouldn't be measured by bylaws or technicalities, but by the willingness to do what needed to be done, especially when the world outside got tough. For me, business boomed, not just in my cul-de-sac, but on the next block over, and even down the street, as word spread that I was the kid you could trust to show up no matter how deep the snow or how sharp the wind. As winter faded into a muddy, thawing spring and the memory of the blizzard softened at the edges, I found myself thinking about what it meant to live somewhere long enough that your kindness, and even your mistakes, became a part of the neighborhood story. Maybe what happened with Karen would become one of those tales people told over backyard barbecues or on the porch at sunset, a reminder that nobody is immune to needing a little help and that sometimes the best way to mend fences is to pick up your shovel and clear a path forward. The bitterness that had settled over our cul-de-sac melted, replaced by a quiet pride in how we'd handled things, and an understanding that, whatever rules might be written or unwritten, the heart of a community beats strongest in moments when people choose compassion, even when it isn't deserved. Looking back on that winter, I see now that every snowstorm brings its own lessons, not just about endurance or effort, but about forgiveness and grace. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't easy or obvious, and sometimes it means stepping up even for someone who hasn't done the same for you. But if there's one thing Buffalo winters, and Buffalo neighbors, taught me, it's that the warmth you give out comes back to you in ways you can't always predict, and that sometimes, the longest, hardest shoveling jobs are the ones that clear the way for something better. So as the ice melted and the days grew longer, I found myself more grateful than ever for the chance to be a small part of this place, for every driveway cleared, every awkward thank you, and every moment we chose, together, to build something stronger than any blizzard could ever bury.